Welcome to the second episode of New Horizons, Living the Faith as a Young Professional, a podcast miniseries of the St. Josemaria Institute. You can listen to all of the episodes of this miniseries on your preferred podcast app, or you can visit the St. Josemaria Institute website at stjosemaria.org. That is stjosemaria.org, and search for New Horizons. My name is Rob Hayes, and I'm your host through this miniseries, which is striving to help you navigate the day-to-day realities of being a young professional by offering some wisdom and guidance from the life and the writings of St. Josemaria Escrivá. Now, in the first episode, we outlined a bit of what we're trying to accomplish in this series together, based upon conversations that St. Josemaria had with young professionals and students back in Spain in the 1930s. So my hope in this series is that, one, it'll guide you with some suitable advice on topics impacting your daily professional life, how to navigate some of those challenges that come up in your workplace and in your career. Second, that it opens up new horizons in your interior lives. I hope that after this series, your prayer life is improved and expanded. And thirdly, I want to encourage and stir up in your heart a desire to live a genuinely Christian life. I want to challenge you to strive for greatness, for sanctity, to strive to live the vocation that God has called specifically for you. Now, we also discussed the importance and beauty of the concept of working for God, meaning that the unseen work of our daily lives, whether in the office, with our families, with our friends, is deeply important and is, in fact, our path to sanctity, our path to heaven. And St. Josemaria demonstrated this importance of working for God by showing gargoyles and spires and lacework on top of the roof of the Burgos Cathedral in Spain to these young people he was meeting with. He was highlighting to them the love that these builders of the cathedral roof had put into the little details, even though absolutely no one would likely ever see them. No one sees spires on top of the middle of the roof, except God. And so we want to be people who put that same type of love of God into our daily work, even if it's never seen. Now, in today's episode, we're going to discuss a really common concern and issue that nearly everyone deals with in the workplace at some point in their career, the reality of dealing with stress and anxiety and maybe even burnout. And I can tell you that this is something that has touched me in significant ways, particularly over the last 5 years. So let me walk you through just a brief personal story. I mentioned in the last episode that I was in the hotel business for nearly 20 years. I started as a senior financial analyst and worked my way up over time into various senior level positions. And the company that I worked for owns hotels all over the U.S., all kinds of brands that you know, within the Hilton family, and Marriott, and Hyatt, and Embassy Suites, and Ritz-Carltons, and all kinds of things. Luxury brands all the way down to stuff on the side of the roads. Well, in 2018 and 2019, when I was the senior executive there, they were solid years in our business. I wasn't the CEO yet, but I was in a position of leadership, and it was an exciting time because we were growing. We were hiring people. We had over 10,000 associates at our companies and our hotels. We were buying hotels. Now, in all these things, we thought there was some risk for a recession over the next few years, but we had built up a big cash balance. We had de-risked a lot of things, and we knew how to manage recessions. We had been through the great financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. If we could handle that, that was the worst thing, in 100 years. We could handle about anything. And so we were cruising. Well, that changed pretty quick. Let me just lay out this timeline of how this went. So in the middle of December of 2019, that was the first time you had this cluster of COVID-19 patients in China. Right? So just roll forward 1 month later, in mid-January, was the first confirmed case in the U.S. of COVID. Roll forward another month, middle of February 2020, our management team started talking internally about how we might respond to this virus and started thinking about some plans. But remember, we, as in the hotel business, have dealt with epidemics and pandemics and things from time to time. We've dealt with Zika and MERS and SARS and Ebola and swine flu and bird flu. And so we thought this would likely be like those, an emergency situation, but probably locally focused. So we weren't particularly worried. We dealt with things like this before. Well, a month later, mid-March 2020, the World Health Organization declares a pandemic, and the utter destruction of our company and our industry began. So just 3 to 4 months after the virus first appears, this was our company's situation. Our annualized revenues as a company, which was several $billion, dropped like 95%. I mean, they almost went to zero. I mean, that is 5 times worse than the worst moment of the financial crisis, 15 years ago. Our hotels went from making on average $40 to $50 million of earnings per month to losing that much per month. We let go and furloughed over 90% of our 10,000 associates. We had hundreds of hotels in a default on their mortgages and were at risk to be foreclosed on. I mean, it was just very much across our industry, utter and total carnage. It was like something out of a movie. You just couldn't think it'd get any worse. But then, one day, the phone rings, and it's the chairman of our board and founder of our company, and the CEO at that time decided to move on from the company. He resigned. And so the chairman was asking me if I was open to considering the job. I mean, he was in some ways asking me, this giant dumpster fire that you're watching, do you want it to be your dumpster fire? And so after some prayer and discussing with my family, I decided to make it my dumpster fire. I took the job. So for me, being the CEO of a hotel company during a pandemic was an attempt to save the company, to try to get thousands of people their jobs back, to avoid bankruptcy, to try to keep my personal net worth from evaporating. And because of that, I was dealing with crushing anxiety, dealing with insomnia and sleepless nights. And for the first time in my life, I began having to fight off panic attacks. And yet, amidst all of that, I was still trying to live the faith and trying to be a faithful husband to my wife and try to be a dedicated and attentive father for my then 6, now 7 children. And so, yes, I have been through the ringer when it comes to stress and anxiety and burnout. Now, not everyone's story has to be so dramatic. I mean, everyone will go through a difficult time in their personal lives, on a stressful project at work or long hours, less than ideal work-life balance. And so I'm not going to give you a step-by-step or how-to process on dealing with these issues. I mean, if you need more technical advice or someone that speaks more directly about these issues, my own recommendation, by the way, is to go check out my friend, Dr. Kevin Majors. He's a Harvard Medical School professor, psychiatrist, who has an amazing program, an app, a podcast called Optimal Work. Optimal Work was a massive help for me over the past 5 years of navigating that amount of stress, and it gives you real tools. I highly recommend it. But that's not what I'm doing. So rather than some step-by-step, I want to propose to you 3 ideas, 3 concepts that are common in the thought of St. Josemaria that I think could be helpful in discussing and chewing on and praying about as you're dealing with these issues. So let's start with the first. And it is the idea and the importance of having unity of life. So what does that mean? Well, let me give you 2 nuggets from St. Josemaria on this issue to explain a bit. So the first is a quote from the Forge, Numbers 694. And he says, Cepit facere et docere. Jesus began to do and then to teach. You and I have to bear witness with our example because we cannot live a double life. We cannot preach what we do not practice. In other words, we have to teach what we are at least struggling to put into practice. And the other one is from the Way, number 579. He says, Faith, it is a pity to see how abundantly many Christians have it on their lips and how sparingly they put it into their actions. One would think it a virtue to be preached only and not one to be practiced. St. Josemaria is pretty blunt here. Can't live a double life. We have to practice what we preach. We can't just have the faith on our lips and not in our lives. And we are called to be the same person in all areas of our life. So in my case, there should not be church Rob and work Rob and Friday night party Rob, though I bet that guy'd be pretty awesome. No, I've got to be the same Rob. You remember the stonemasons we discussed in the last episode. They saw their daily work as a way to worship God. And this is an example of solid unity of life. Tuesday Steve or Sally is the same as Sunday Steve or Sally. So ask yourself, are you the same person in the office on Tuesday morning versus the person you are on Friday night versus the person you are on Sunday morning. And some people really question whether or not they can even really do this. I mean, can I serve God and serve the world at the same time? Sometimes you feel like you live in 2 or 3 completely different worlds, and it's hard to maybe even choose one. So St. Josemaria answered this very directly. This is Friends of God, number 165. He says, "There is no clash, no opposition between serving God and serving men, between the exercise of our civic rights and duties and our religious ones, between the commitment to build up and improve the earthly city and the conviction that we are passing through the world on our way to our heavenly homeland. Here too, as I never tire repeating," and this is my little side point here, let me emphasize this part to you guys. He says, "We can see that unity of life is an essential condition for those who are trying to sanctify themselves in the midst of the ordinary situations of their work, of their family, and social relationships." Right? Unity of life is essential. You are the one person that must live your faith fully in all areas of life. And there are real consequences to this lack of unity of life. Because if there is a tension or there's hypocrisy there, it does and can and will grind on us. We are not built to sustain double lives successfully over time. We are pretty good at faking it for a while, but we can't be sustainable in living a double life. And that hypocrisy hurts our relationships. It makes it impossible to build authentic friendships because we aren't really sharing who we are, at least with some of our friends. And so it makes our professional work so much more difficult because we don't feel like we can bring our whole self to our work. This double life rattles us. It numbs our conscience. And St. Josemaria, frankly, just calls out lack of unity of life as absurd. In the way, point number 353, he says, "Have you ever stopped to think how absurd it is to leave one's Catholicism aside on entering the university, a professional association, a cultural society, or parliament, like a man leaving his hat at the door?" Well, let's not be absurd, people. Let's work on being people that don't leave our hats of faith at the front door of our office building or our friend next door or whatever. So if you're dealing with aspects of stress and anxiety or burnout, one point is to check to see if you are striving to live a true unity of life, or are you experiencing stress and anxiety because you feel the tension between who you know you ought to be and who you are at the office. All right. But not only can a lack of unity of life cause us stress and anxiety, but also a lack of the virtue of order. So that'll be the second point we're going to talk about here. We need to have right priorities and habits to live well. We need order in order to live virtue. So in the way, number 79, St. Josemaria says, "Virtue without order, strange virtue." All right, so we can't live virtue. We can't deal with our difficult situations if we don't have order and right priorities. But here's a question. What are my priorities? What are your priorities? And the reality is that priorities are actually quite easy to see. It's how you spend your time. How you spend your time is the physical manifestation of, the physical embodiment of your priorities. Did you get dressed this morning? Well, it was because it was a priority. Did you sleep last night? Well, it's a priority. Did you brush your teeth? It's a priority. So there's all these things that we get done every day. We don't even think about them, but we've made them priorities in our lives. But what about mental prayer? Did you make it to Mass today? Did you pray the rosary? Are there other acts of piety that you're doing? Are those actual priorities for you? So this is a question we all need to be frequently asking ourselves. Do we really put first things first? Because if we don't, our lives become disordered. We lack virtue. And if that happens, stress and anxiety and burnout are not far behind. In addition, some people think that maybe if their time is filled up, that if they're busy and active, then that is basically the same thing as being ordered, because maybe I'm decently organized. Unfortunately, they equate frantic activity as actual productivity and growth. But activity that is not properly ordered or organized is just wasting time. St. Josemaria speaks to this in Forge number 506. It goes, "You are untiring in your activity, but you fail to put order into it. So you do not have as much effect as you should." And it puts me in mind of something I heard once from a very authoritative source. I happened to praise a subordinate in front of his superior. I said, "How hard he works." "You ought to say I was told how much he rushes around." You are untiring in your activity, but it is all fruitless, how much you rush around. So the virtue of order does not mean we are doing lots of stuff. It means we spend our time doing first things first. And the consequence of all this is that we can gain peace, because order brings peace. And peace is the opposite of the stress, anxiety, and burnout we're dealing with. So Forge 808, St. Josemaria highlights this way that order brings peace. It says, "Order will bring harmony to your life and lead you to perseverance. Order will give peace to your heart and dignity to your composure." Right? To live this virtue, and to be truly productive, to have peace, the peace we need to navigate stressful situations, we need to live this virtue of order. So challenge yourself. Ask yourself, if I'm dealing with stress and anxiety and burnout, am I living this virtue well? Am I well ordered? And if not, you need to do something about it. So we've mentioned the importance of unity of life, and we want to be the same person at all points of our days, and the virtue of order, that we need to have first things first and good priorities. Well, let's turn perhaps to the most important of these 3 points that I want to discuss today, and it's the crucial nature of having a daily spiritual game plan. This is what St. Josemaria would call a plan of life. And this is tied to order, by the way. Right? The reason you have this plan is to help with this order. St. Josemaria once wrote in The Way, number 76, "Without a plan of life, you will never have order." Right? Well, we were just talking about the importance of order. Well, how do we grow in it? The answer is by building out a spiritual game plan and to start living it. My experience has been that if someone is experiencing intense burnout or stress at the office or really any time in their life, many times it's because their prayer life, their life of piety, is on the rocks or perhaps non-existent. And therefore their priorities in life are all messed up. They're all in the wrong order. This lack of unity of life and the lack of the virtue of order many times can be traced back to not having a vibrant prayer life or not having a game plan for a vibrant prayer life. We need our prayer lives to be the top priority to flourish. But we, one, don't always have a plan, and two, if we do, we don't even make time for it. So how do we do that? Well, let's define some terms here. What does St. Josemaria mean by plan of life? First of all, what he doesn't mean is crazy heroic feats of hyper sanctity. He says in Friends of God, number 149, "When we examine how our piety is and what it should be like, that is what specific points of our personal relationship with God need improving. You will reject the temptation of imagining fantastic feats, because you will have discovered that our Lord is quite happy if we offer him little tokens of love any moment of the day." Prayer life, piety, are shown by and large in the little moments of the day, in the ordinary. So, how do we do it? What's the plan? St. Josemaria offers us some suggestions. So he continues on in that Friends of God number 149. He says, "Try to commit yourself to a plan of life and keep to it. A few minutes of mental prayer, Holy Mass, daily, if you can manage it, frequent communion, regular recourse to the Holy Sacrament of Forgiveness, even though your conscience does not accuse you of mortal sin, visiting Jesus in the tabernacle, praying and contemplating the mysteries of the Holy Rosary, and so many other marvelous devotions that you know or can learn. These things are nothing out of the ordinary. but rather a game plan that is composed of the typical, usual, traditional acts of a life of piety of a Catholic. Morning offerings. You should be giving your day to God. Mental prayer. Some quiet time with our Lord to speak with Him. Trying to go to Mass. The Rosary. Spiritual reading. Going to confession. Maybe you're saying an Angelus or Regina Caeli at noon. Saying Memorares, which are beautiful little short Marian prayers. An examination of conscience before bed, etc. These are all tools and things and prayers that Catholics have done for hundreds and even thousands of years. And St. Josemaria continues in that same Friends of God number 149 passage to give additional good advice about our plan of life. He says, "You should not let them become rigid rules or watertight compartments. They should be flexible to help you on your journey, you who live in the middle of the world, with a life of hard professional work and social ties and obligations which you should not neglect, because in them your conversation with God still continues. Your plan of life ought to be like a rubber glove which fits the hand perfectly." I absolutely love this image. Your plan of life ought to be like a rubber glove which fits the hand perfectly. Right? It's catered to your own personal circumstances and schedule. It doesn't and won't look exactly like the plan of life of others. But it does need to be a plan. It needs to be tangible, an actual list of things that we are striving to do to live out our day. Now, sometimes our eyes do get bigger than our stomach. Who hasn't attempted to bite off more they can chew for maybe a New Year's, or maybe it's a Lenten resolution? And so he does warn about this as well. He says, again, further on in Friends of God 149, "Please don't forget that the important thing does not lie in doing many things. Limit yourself generously to those you can fulfill each day, whether or not you happen to feel like doing them. These pious practices will lead you, almost without realizing it, to contemplative prayer. Your soul will pour forth more acts of love, aspirations, acts of thanksgiving, acts of atonement, spiritual communions, and this will happen while you go about your ordinary duties, when you answer the telephone, you get on a bus, open or close a door, pass in front of a church, when you begin a new task. During it, and when you've finished it, you will find yourself referring everything you do to your Father God." This is a vision of living a life of contemplation in the middle of the world, fulfilling a plan of life, a daily plan of prayer, of piety amidst our normal routines, and doing it all with naturalness and solely for the love of God. This advice, this aspect of only doing as well, kind of a small thing but being faithful in it, is one of the most frequent pieces of advice I end up giving to people. People who have some ambition, people that want to grow, they want to boil the ocean. And the reality is one of the most effective things that we can do is pick one thing, maybe two, but usually one, and do it with fidelity and do it with a commitment to do it at all costs. It also, though, we have to do this plan of life not as a checklist, not as a to-do list, but with love. Because if not, life and work become monotony. Burnout and stress are not far behind if we're not filling our daily life and our prayer life with love. St. Josemaria says in the Way, number 77, "This tying of one's life to a plan, to a timetable, you tell me, is so monotonous." And I answer, there's monotony because there is little love. So perhaps if you're having a hard time being regular in your prayer, or inconsistent in putting up together a plan, or if you find your plan is boring or monotonous, it's probably because you need more love. You need more love of God. Pray for more love of God. And to live this plan, even, let's say your heart is full of love, even these plans are not easy. They're demanding. But St. Josemaria reminds us that we have to persevere. In the Forge, number 81, he says, "You must be constant and demanding with yourself in your regular practices of piety. Also, when you feel tired or they seem to be arid, persevere. Those moments are like the tall red-painted poles which serve as markers along the mountain roads when there are heavy snowfalls. They are always there to show where it is safe to go. So yes, living this plan of life is not easy. But as you know, nothing worth doing is easy. But we must remain faithful to it, regardless of our feelings, regardless of our circumstances, because it provides the guidance and structure and grace that we need to preserve through the challenges of our daily life, that we need to persevere through the obstacles that we have to navigate every day, including the topic at hand, the stresses and anxieties of work. And so we now know what this plan of life might look like, but how do I possibly make time for a plan? I mean, we're all busy people. I mean, we already have too much to do, right? Well, this is a bit of a flashback for me. I can remember being 30 years old, a young executive, trying to climb up the ranks of my company. My wife and I had been married for maybe 4 years, 3 or 4 years. We just had our third son. Life was completely crazy. I mean, having 3 boys under 3 at that time was always an adventure. So I was having lunch from time to time with this wonderful priest, Father Jack Solarski, God rest his soul, who had lived with and had known St. Josemaria back in Rome years ago. And Father Jack, over a great plate of Tex-Mex one day for lunch, was challenging me to take my prayer life more seriously, make time for it, make it a priority, because I was incredibly inconsistent with it. As a result, not surprisingly, my spiritual life was incredibly inconsistent. And so one day he brought a book with him, and he gave it to me. It's a short book called Time for God by Father Jacques Philippe. It's published by Scepter Publishers. It's easy to find online. Again, I highly recommend it. And this book challenged me on several fronts when it came to making prayer life and plan of life a priority. I like this book so much, I'm actually reading it right now in a discussion group with a bunch of friends. But I want to highlight 2 points of time for God that are applicable to this discussion of living a plan of life and what objections someone might have to doing it well. All right, the first is a reminder that without a life of prayer, without a consistent plan of life, there's no holiness. And therefore, we will not be in a place where we can effectively deal with anxiety or stress in any real way. I mean, if we don't have virtue, we don't have sanctity, it's really hard to deal with anxiety and stress. So we need to be convinced of the vital importance of mental prayer and a plan of life. And this is the story of the saints throughout the history of the church. And we need to remember that all the saints have spent substantive time in prayer. I mean, all of them have had spiritual game plans. There's no spiritual progress without contemplative prayer, without a plan of life. So even though we may have had powerful conversion experiences, maybe we've felt great fervor at times of our life, and all of us have received immense graces, without fidelity to living a daily life of prayer, our Christian life stalls. And this is because without mental prayer and without a life of piety, we cannot help to receive all of the things from God that He wants to give us. We need to be transformed and need to flourish, but there can be no deep, radical purification of our hearts and minds without this life of prayer. And without our plan of life, our wisdom, our prudence remain on a human plane, and we will never reach true inner freedom or peace that we need to overcome the stresses and anxieties of our work life. So without a life of prayer, without a plan, we will not have holiness, virtue, or peace. All right, so you say, fine, Rob, I agree. It's true. But there's a problem. How in the world do I find time for this? I mean, I'm already too busy to make this happen. And frankly, that's what I thought. That's what I said when Father Jack first gave me Time for God, the book. But here's what Father Philippe says about that. He said, first of all, it's a common response. It's said all the time. You're not unique in that comment. And the reality is that in a hyperactive, distracted world like our own, the difficulty is undoubtedly a real one. I mean, you can't underestimate it in some ways. But, and this is the important but time is rarely the real problem. The real problem is knowing what really matters in life. The real problem is your priorities. And that was the point that Father Jack really drilled home with me. So it comes back to the virtue of order we discussed. In order to make a plan of life happen, it's got to be a true priority for us, which means we need to be well ordered and know what our priorities actually need to be. And we need to trust that if we are faithful, right, if we have the priorities straight, God gives us the grace to get all the things done we need to get done. I mean, he even gives us this image of multiplying time in the Gospels. In Mark 10, he says, there is no one that has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or land for my sake and for the gospel who will not receive 100-fold now in this time. Well, Father Philippe argues that this is a legitimate way to also be applied to chronological time, that whoever gives up a quarter of an hour of television in order to pray will receive 100-fold in this life, that time will be returned to us 100-folds, and not always necessarily purely in quantity, but also in quality. So putting our priorities of our mental prayer and plan of life first gives us the grace to live out every moment of our lives in a much more fruitful way. Time gets returned to us. And St. Josemaria highlighted this all the time. And, in the way, in number 80, he says, when you bring order into your life, your time will multiply. And then you will be able to give God more glory by working more in his service. Right? So if we give God our time, our attention, and lay our priorities at his feet,